But I'd like to thank our Natural Resources Chair, Kim Marchand, for putting this together. And a special thanks to today's event sponsor, Dietz and Davis. Carolyn Steffel, an attorney with Dietz and Davis, is here to represent the sponsor, and she's here to also introduce the presenters. So, Carolyn, please take it away.
Thank you. Wow, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce the sponsors. I was very excited about this talk because it kind of is a combination of my personal life, my professional life, and my work on the bar. So on the Bar Association, I'm the president-elect. And so encourage any of you I have not met to reach out to me if you have any suggestions about the bar. And in terms of the Marshall Fire, I was lived in Louisville for over 20 years before the Marshall Fire, and then lost my home to the Marshall Fire. I've got 2 teenage kids, so we were evacuated and have now moved back to Superior, but have really gone through that whole piece from a personal standpoint. And our firm is happy to sponsor because we've had 2 shareholders who both lost their homes and several others who were evacuated, and we're very thankful not to lose their homes. So this directly impacted us on a personal matter. And then professionally, I represent water districts. And so I'm very interested in what the response was and how we can help others to prepare for similar situations. So I really thank all of you who are the speakers for being here. And here are your speakers. So there are 2 engineers and 2 attorneys on the line. From an engineering standpoint, we have first of all, Corey Peterson, who is a water resource engineer for almost 25 years, with a strong background in water and civil engineering, with expertise in water resources, hydrology, and environmental engineering. He works in the city of Louisville, Colorado, which, as you know, Louisville and Superior were the 2 hardest hit towns for this fire, and works on water quality and quantity for the city. We also have Katrin Leone, who has she has over 15 years of engineering experience with surface and groundwater hydrology, historical consumptive use analysis, augmentation plans, change of water rights, and more, doing modeling and augmentation plan accounting. She has also served as an expert witness and is a registered professional engineer in the state of Colorado. In terms of the attorneys, we have Alan Hill, who's been practicing law in Colorado since 1981, focusing on water rights. He is the water attorney for the city of Louisville and also represents other municipalities and special districts, as well as agriculture users and developers, focusing on water rights litigation, development, and protection. Then we have Ashley Polik Zaheda, who is one of the founding members of Hill and Polik LLC, and she got her law degree from University of Denver in 2007 and focuses on representing municipalities and special districts on matters including water, also wrote property contracts, land use, open records, and just general matters. So with that, I would love to hand this over to your speakers.
Do you want to start, Corey, or?
Oh, we were joking about it. I figured you were going to give us a go, and then I'll jump in.
All right, we're going to go back and forth between the 2 of us. So when we were asked to put this together, we were both reflecting on, my being a consultant for the city of Louisville and Corey working for the city of Louisville, our collective experiences with the Marshall Fire on very different extremes, and then the aftermath. And so this presentation tries to wrap all of that together. And Corey, please jump in at any time. So just to give you guys an overview of the city of Louisville, the city has 2 kind of main sources of water. They divert water rights from South Boulder Creek, and then they also receive Trans-Basin water, Windy Gap, and CBT water. They have 3 main storage reservoirs, and these will become kind of readily apparent a little bit later in the presentation. Louisville Reservoir, Harper Reservoir, and Marshall Reservoir. Marshall Reservoir is a facility owned by FRICO that Louisville stores water in. Their city's water rights are comprised of direct flow water rights and exchanges and storage water rights. The city operates 2 water treatment plants. There's a plant on the north side of the city, the Sid Copeland water treatment plant, and then one on the south side of the city, the Howard Berry water treatment plant. The city provides water service for 2,867 residents and approximately 1,203 businesses. So this map is a map of the Louisville water service system, or the Louisville water system. And so you can see, let's see if this will work, kind of over here, we have South Boulder Creek. The city diverts water from South Boulder Creek in 2 methods. One, using the community ditch to bring water into Marshall, and then delivery from Marshall into the Howard Berry water treatment plant. Or they can also divert from the Louisville pipeline, which can take water to the Howard Berry water treatment plant, or it can run it further north to the Sid Copeland water treatment plant. Along the lines, or along the way, you have the 2 smaller reservoirs, Harper Reservoir and Louisville Reservoir. And these 3 reservoirs serve as terminal storage for the city. The city's Trans-Basin water comes in from the Southern Water Supply Pipeline from Northern, and then connects over to the Sid Copeland water treatment plant. So the lead up to the Marshall Fire was sort of a unique period for us here on the Front Range. We had a very, very wet spring, followed by an abnormally dry summer and winter. And by the time we reached December of 2021, we were still awaiting measurable snowfall in the Louisville and the Marshall Fire area. The wet spring had led to an extremely high fire risk. We had a lot of abundant, dry native grass. And then we also had the same drying conditions that had taken place over the summer affected our urban structures, our houses, our buildings, and then the landscape surrounding those. You can see from this graph here, which is just the 2021 precip, that we have, an extremely wet spring followed by a very, very dry late summer and into winter. This, coupled with an extreme, what the meteorologists are saying, an extreme mountain wave event, was the perfect conditions for a very terrible fire scenario. We had downsloping winds that accelerated as they came down off the mountains, off the Front Range. They were sustained at 50 to 60 miles an hour. And then we had gusts measured at 110 miles an hour at Rocky Flats, which is just south of the Marshall Lake area. From the Louisville water treatment plant standpoint, the city was operating as a fairly typical winter. They were operating 1 water treatment plant, their North water treatment plant, the Sid Copeland plant, and they were seeing an average daily demand of about 4.5 acre feet per day. Storage tanks were full. Everything was just pretty much as you expect, working perfectly and normally. South Boulder Creek, because of the dry spring or dry summer and fall, we had lower stream flows. As we're going into the winter, what happens periodically on South Boulder Creek are icing conditions. As South Boulder Creek comes through El Dorado Canyon, you can see the ice build up in the canyon in certain places, which affects the stream flows and then ultimately affects the water that's available for diversion down below. The city of Louisville has, the typical water rights portfolio we were just talking about. It's mainly comprised of direct flow water rights. The city also has storage water rights, and then we have CBT. I didn't put Windy Gap on here, but it would be in this sliver as well. This section over here is basically what the city had available to them in December of 2021. They had carryover storage on the south side of the system, which is typically Marshall Reservoir. And they had carryover storage on the north side of the system, which is Harper Reservoir and Louisville Reservoir. They had water rights available to them to divert for their storage right under their senior storage right. And this is typical with a storage water right. It can occur during the entire winter fill season. And so it can be limited by the stream flows. And then they also had available to them CBT water delivered through the pipeline. Then we arrive on the 30th of 2021. And I'm going to let Corey talk about this because he's much more familiar with this, how this works or how this went down.
Great, thanks, Katie. Yeah, so from this one, this just gives a very high level of the timeline that we saw with the Marshall Fire. We'll dive into this a little bit more in a couple other slides, but the big one is it was a relatively small fire, only 6,000 acres, but the most destructive wildfire in Colorado history. Not a record that you like to have, but again, just kind of shows this progression as it moved from west to east into the cities of both Superior and Louisville. So we can hop to the next one. Here's kind of the graph that just shows the overall impact of the Marshall Fire. The big orange spot is the damage areas. As you can see, it went all the way around Marshall Lake, which, as Katie was mentioning, is our main drinking water supply, and then worked its way from the south towards the north and the east. So we go to the next one. So this is where I'll get into the more detail. So this is the city's water team that responded to the Marshall Fire. And we'll kind of go through all the different processes, but wanted to take a moment and really just recognize that it wasn't just me, there was a lot of other folks that were involved, and not just the city of Louisville, but other folks around there. So if we go to the next slide, this is kind of the timeline. This is where the details are. Like any good supervisor, I was taking time off on December 30th and was sitting at home enjoying the holiday break. I'm sure many of you may remember this day, and as Katie mentioned, it was a typical kind of sunny winter, windy day. We had our single water treatment plant running our north plant because of the low demands, and our Howard Berry treatment plant, or what we call south, was offline. So I received a text from our superintendent that said there was a grass fire near our south plant and it had been called into the fire department. The photo on the bottom left here is from our security camera, where you can see the smoke in the background. And my response was quite simply, hope they go quick with this wind. Boy, were we wrong, but it is what it is. So Howard Berry is a little over 2 miles away from the ignition points. And so with those high winds, the fire was within the plant site starting at 11 to noon. So meaning the fire covered the distance of a football field about every minute. The town of Superior was hit soon after our treatment plant. Our thoughts in those early moments was how could we support our neighbors as they dealt with the fire impact. So the plant staff were already increasing our production at the north plant facility that was running, and we had hit max capacity within a couple hours. So Louisville and Superior have an interconnect that allows us to share potable water back and forth. So 2 plant staff went around the edges of the fire on the west side with the help of emergency responders, and were able to get to our south treatment plant after the fire had gone through. So this was during the middle of the evacuation. So the fire was obviously increasing in size. There were trees down, power lines across the roads, very hazardous to say the least. So these 2 individuals were able to make it to the plant, and they had to manually open up the valve at the interconnect because we had lost power to this facility. So with water flowing to Superior, staff retreated back to the relatively safety of the north plant. And, they joked kind of after the fact that these 2 commented that that was the fastest they'd ever opened a valve ever. So at this point, the fire crossed US 36 and entered into Louisville, and we went from helping Superior to being in trouble ourselves. So without power or communication, we lost the ability to see our tanks, and we had no idea what was happening with our tank readings. So once again, staff went back in to visually inspect our tank elevations. So what this entailed is one of our members, Jeff Owens, had to climb our 25-foot tall high zone tank, and in hurricane force winds, he belly crawled across the top of the tank to look inside. Seeing about a foot of water in the bottom of our tanks, we knew things were bad. And with the risk of hydrants running dry and the system dropping pressure, we made the decision that goes against pretty much every standard operation that we have as water treatment plant operators, which is we decided to manually open up our valves and allow the gravity pressure of the Marshall Lake to flow untreated water into our distribution system. So with the addition of the raw water, we were now pushing 13 MGD, or about 9,000 GPM into the system. And we were literally giving everything we could at that point. So with water flowing, our next priority became restoring power. So the south plant has a backup generator. However, this generator runs off of natural gas. And so in response to the fire, Xcel had rightfully cut off gas service to the area. And so we were talking with Incident Command, explaining the needs to upstand both the Superior water treatment plant that was out of water, and then of course our south plant. Xcel was able to reestablish Superior, but there were too many power lines down for south plant to start. So once again, we had to get creative. Xcel had portable natural gas tankers that were available, and it's shown in the far right picture. And we were able to hook up a temporary supply. In order for Xcel to make the delivery, there needed to be a supervisor on site. So that's when I came in on site, and I came in westbound up 36 and down McCaslin and through Superior to get to the plant. And I was about 15 minutes before the tanker showed up. And so as you see in the background of that photo, there were several homes that were actively burning while we were connecting these portable natural gas tanks to the system. So at about 11 p.m. that night, 12 hours after the fire started, we had restored power to the treatment plant. Being able to see our tank levels wasn't very helpful. We could see it, but we weren't gaining anything. So again, producing 13 MGD, really not going anywhere. So we once again started our assessment process. Using best guesses of kind of the fire and the containment and the info that we had, we started doing some pretty quick math and realized that we had somewhere between 500 to 1,000 homes that were destroyed, and their service lines were uncontrollably spewing water from the distribution system, causing us to lose power. So essentially the system was bleeding from 1,000 cuts and we couldn't stabilize. So the public works director and 3 members of the ops team went into the burn area and began shutting down individual homes and isolating neighborhoods. This took an incredible amount of coordination as the fire changed directions, and flare-ups required previously closed area systems to be reopened and then re-shut down. So through all these efforts, the tank slowly began to rise. And at the same time, the treatment plant staff stayed at the Howard Berry plant to get it fully operational. The city was able to get potable water and have that facility back in compliance by 5:30 in the morning. So with that, we can go to the next slide. So Katie, I don't know if you want to take over with the actual demands here.
Yeah, I'll tag in here. So the picture on the left is just a close-up of Marshall Lake and where the Howard Berry water treatment plant exists. And like Corey described, they can deliver water by gravity from the lake to the plant. One of the things that happened during the fire is, as Corey described, demands just increased rapidly. They were trying to fight the fire at on behalf of both Superior and Louisville and provide water to both cities. and they did max out the capacity at the Sid Copeland water treatment plant. Corey just described that the water tanks got dangerously low, and they opened up an interconnect with Superior. And they ended up sending that untreated water through the Howard Berry plant and into the city. The graph down below shows the daily water treatment plant demand, basically from the day before the fire to several days after the fire. And the line at the top, the yellow line, shows the max August demand for that same year. And so you can see that prior to the fire, and even kind of early on in the fire, that the demand was actually fairly low, right around that 4.5 acre feet per day. Starting about January 1st and running through, and we'll explain in just a minute why this continues beyond just the fire itself, but running through the 6th, that demand just spikes up to almost being equivalent to a max summer demand. And so, keep in mind that they're trying to meet this demand with limited diversions available from South Boulder Creek. So the next thing that we did as Corey and the treatment staff and the public works staff at Louisville were dealing with the disaster on the ground, I'm sitting back going, what can I do to help? And so it was my job to help them get more water. Where can we get additional supplies? And so the first call that we made on behalf of the city was to the Division of Water Resources. And the call was interesting because at the time, South Boulder Creek and Boulder Creek did not have a water commissioner. The water commissioner had just resigned. And so the operations were being handled by the Division 1 office, which makes it a little bit interesting. So the first call was to Brent Shantz, and said the city needs to take emergency diversions off of South Boulder Creek. The couple days before the fire, the city had actually stopped diverting from the creek, and they had stopped because the stream flow was pretty low, and the icing conditions were just making it difficult for them to actually divert water. So they request this emergency permission to divert, which was granted immediately. And then while that was working through their chain of command at the state's level, we also reached out to FRICO. So FRICO operates the community ditch and operates Marshall Lake, Marshall Reservoir. And the call to FRICO advised them that Louisville was going to start diverting pretty much the entire flow of South Boulder Creek. And that would happen upstream of the community ditch. So FRICO would likely see a big reduction in what was available to them. While on the phone with FRICO, we get a call back from Brent Shantz. He goes, hey, you should talk to Denver Water. So we called Denver Water back. We're talking with Nathan Elder over at Denver Water, and Denver Water agrees to make emergency releases from Gross Reservoir to boost South Boulder Creek stream flows. And so that water is going to come down and allow the city to make some of these emergency diversions. Going on at the same time, the city of Superior, they opened the interconnect, Louisville to Superior, and then later on Superior to Louisville. Simultaneously, in the grand scheme of things, Northern Water was also able to increase the flow in the delivery pipeline to bring more water down, more CBT water down. And then all of this was done with just daily coordinate and sometimes multiple times a day coordination with DWR and Denver Water to make these additional supplies available. So this graph is a graph of the South Boulder Creek stream flow, and the kind of orange block in the center represents the Marshall Fire emergency. So the darker orange is the actual first day of the fire. And then the lighter orange represents the period when Louisville was making emergency diversions off of the creek. The blue line is the, I'm going to say, estimated stream flow in South Boulder Creek. Keep in mind, we were seeing icing conditions. And so you will see very odd stream flow measurements that are not real, sometimes up to 30 CFS, just because the gauge is iced over. And so this is our best estimate of what the stream flows actually look like during the period from mid-December to mid-January. The dark black dashed line is the historical stream flow. So you can see that the South Boulder Creek was significantly below historical stream flow conditions. The green line demonstrates the supplemental release made from Gross Reservoir that Denver made to help boost those stream flows. And you can see that it helped. They went from about 4.5, maybe 5 CFS in the creek up to 10, 12 CFS. And that water was available to be diverted at the City of Louisville pipeline to bring directly into the treatment plant to help with firefighting and all of the post-fire activities that we'll talk about here in just a minute. So, you know, like I mentioned, there was a lot of cooperation between the entities that help provide water, and I thought you guys might want to see some of the background about how that was accounted for, how that was done. So Northern Water was able to increase this flow in the pipeline for deliveries to Louisville. And that water that they delivered was partially Louisville's CBT water and partially reserve, or what they call rollover CBT water, stored in Carter Lake. And so Northern had developed a practice of using some of this water that was in Carter Lake that wasn't specifically allocated to an individual entity to help with firefighting. And they've done that for the firefighting efforts that were west of Loveland and Fort Collins. I think that's the Cameron Peak fire. And so they did that, a similar operation where they donated water to Louisville. Denver Water, when they increased their releases from Gross Reservoir to boost the stream flow, they allowed the city to divert that water for the firefighting efforts. It seems like, or actually it is, that the water came out of the Other River account from Gross Reservoir. And so that they just made that water available more real time than smoothed out in a normal operation. The town of Superior provided water, 1 MGD to Louisville via the interconnect. That was categorized as fully consumable potable water. And then FRICO, they allowed the city of Louisville to borrow their senior Marshall Lake storage right. So as the stream flow was increasing and Louisville was taking it at the pipeline, which is slightly upstream from the community ditch, they just took that water in and colored it under the city's water rights. And then once things settled down, the city looked at how much of that water should have been diverted by FRICO, and we were able to do a book over in the accounting in mid-January to make FRICO whole. Throughout this all, the city was assisted by DWR. They provided, coordination with emergency water supplies, helping point directions of people to talk to at Denver Water. And then they assisted with the administration of those emergency diversions and the accounting. And so it was a multiple time a day, how much water's coming down, how much are you picking up type thing, so that they could, in as much as possible, keep the stream whole. The disaster did not stop when the fire did. And so this is the after the flames. I'm going to turn it back over to Corey to talk about the other challenges the city had.
Yep. Thanks, Katie. So again, having flooded the city with raw water, we had violated our state drinking water standards. And so we were having conversations with Colorado Department of Health throughout, and we developed a plan to return the water system back to service. And so what we had to do is we had to flush the entire system of the raw water. And so the city typically does kind of a routine flushing exercise. We flush about 1/3 of the city every year, and this process takes us about 4 to 6 weeks. And we typically do that in late spring. So after the Marshall Fire, with the support of the surrounding community, we brought in crews from Boulder and Longmont and some others, and they led teams around the clock for flushing activities. Also during a snowstorm, where we got over a foot of snow dumped on us, and we were able to complete the entire system flushing in 4 days. So we started on January 1st or January 2nd, and we finished just before January 6th. And with that, CDPHE was able to lift the boil order because we were able to successfully demonstrate that the system had been returned to potable. And that allowed the majority of the city residents to come back in and once again start using the water. The next challenge that we ran into this is emerging science and research that was unknown to us, but we learned an awful lot about, outlined a whole nother concern of fire impacted communities. And what those were is they were volatile organic chemicals, or VOC contamination. Essentially, VOCs are in everyday products, but mostly are included in plastic pipes. And so when heated or melted, these plastic pipes can release known carcinogens like benzene and styrene and a bunch of other nasty stuff. And that can range from mild sickness like nausea, headaches, and dizziness to more serious health risks like increased risks of cancer, liver disease, kidney, and nerve damage. So with the loss of pressure that we saw with the Marshall Fire, these chemicals that melted within the homes backflowed into the city system, and those had to be flushed as well. So the system was originally isolated in the burn areas, and we were able to take potable clean water and systematically move it through the fire burn zone, flushing out this VOC contamination. And that took us all the way to February to get the entire system cleaned. And then we did a similar process with each individual home as they come online. So even today, we are still doing flushing and testing based off of potential VOC contamination to ensure that the city system remains safe and that the drinking water provided is good to go.
So as Corey mentioned, the city is moving forward, and the city has also seen quite a bit of rebuilding after the Marshall Fire. And this slide just illustrates that the city is recovering. We wanted to give a special thanks to the entities and the people, specific people who really provided support during the Marshall Fire emergency. And this is by no means a complete list. This is tried to focus just on the water rights side of things, but there are so many other entities out there that were just absolutely vital. So we'd like to recognize Denver Water and specifically Nathan Elder, Farmers Reservoir and Irrigation Company, Lonnie Lewis. Lonnie is I guess his title is probably lake tender for Marshall Lake, and I believe he actually had to evacuate during the fire. But he's our main contact for the city. But we also worked with Glenn Donaldson, and then Diana Medina at FRICO is our accounting coordinator that we work with, and so we'd like to thank them. The town of Superior, the public works staff, Northern Water, administration, engineering, and operations staff, and then the Division of Water Resources. And Brent, I know, is no longer with the state, but we're lumping him in there right now. So Brent and Jason Smith, who is our current water commissioner, acting water commissioner, Michael Hine and Corey DeAngelis. And I'm going to give Corey this slide.
Yeah, and then for the last slide, unfortunately, Louisville and Superior and unincorporated Boulder County are part of a unique club that nobody wants to be a part of, which is victims of wildfire. Couple staff from Louisville had an opportunity to travel to Maui this summer to help them with their recovery. It's one of those things that we relied on as we were going through our impacts with the Marshall Fire. Folks from Paradise, California and Santa Rosa, California, as well as Oregon, reached out to us and helped us with developing system recovery protocols and allowed us to then pay that forward. So we took what we learned from those folks and actually joined a few of those communities out there in Maui, and were able to pass on the lessons that we learned to help them with their recovery.
And then our last slide is just resilient Louisville. And I think at this point we would open it up to any questions.
If nobody else has a question, I do, Katie and Corey. I guess from the legal perspective, we scratch our head a little bit and wonder about the next fire and how much water is going to be owed back to, for example, in this case, Marshall or whatever. Do you think cooperation and the help that you got is enough, or should there be some rules in place about how water is used or needs to be augmented or replaced after a catastrophic event like this?
I can certainly start with this and then I'll let Katie jump in. You know, I think one thing that we've seen from a Louisville standpoint is there's always an opportunity to learn and improve operations, whether it's before or after a fire. You know, I'll speak quite frankly, there weren't a whole lot of concerns about what the rules of the river were when we were in the middle of it. You know, a lot of the things that we felt like we were doing was, hey, we're going to take this diversion and then damn the consequences and figure it out later. I think that would be helpful for operators in the future to know that there's a system that's already in place, and that doesn't take that fear or potential scariness to move those things forward. So I do think there is something to be had, and I think there's a potential adjustment in the future.
So I think I'll just chime into what Corey said. I think that unfortunately every fire is unique. And so what might work for Louisville might not work for another entity. And it really depends on the situation at the time. But in the grand scheme of things, as far as post-fire recovery operations and watershed protection and that type of assistance, I think that we could form a roadmap that would outline some best practices within the water rights to help those situations. I hope that no one ever has to experience this again, recognizing it will happen. I just hope that they get the cooperation and the help that they need in real time.
Corey, there are a couple of questions in the chat that I think are pretty much addressed to you.
Yeah, I'll start with the first one. I don't know if everybody can see the chat popping up, but I'll just comment on the emergency planning that went in place beforehand. That really was something, a backbone that it starts with both an aggressive capital improvement program and just an operations team. So we did make quite a few improvements to the city recently that was very helpful. At our north facility, we replaced our pump station, and that thing was about 15 to 20 years old. And we ended up with a problem where at very high flows, the pumps would actually cavitate and lock out. And so by replacing that pump station prior to the fire, it allowed the north plant to run at that 8 MGD, nonstop. The other thing that we do is we routinely practice operating our facilities without SCADA. That helped us immensely when the power went down, and not only did we not have electricity, but there was no SCADA operations. So our operators knew which valves needed to be turned and where they were located. That was a big piece. I think the other thing that is really important is just the awareness of wildfire interface that we're seeing on the Front Range. Most communities, at least hopefully most communities, have source water protection plans and those type of things in place. Louisville actually has one. Wildfire was listed as a concern and a hazard that we were known to look at, but it was always in the mountains. You know, it was more on supply and source water protection, not necessarily what would happen inside the city boundaries. So yes, I think there's always that proactive approach of you think things will never happen and then they do, and now you become an expert in a lot of things that you never thought you were going to be. Let me scroll down. The next one was FEMA. So yes, both Superior and Louisville were able to get FEMA assistance. There was a variety of impacts and those components. Very few of it was actually tied to the water supply and the water rights, because again, we were able to negotiate that with the different entities, but the city did get FEMA reimbursement for a lot of the impacts and resiliency projects moving forward. At least that's what we hope. Oh, yeah, that's another great question for, is it Justin? It's very small on my screen. Sorry about that, folks. So yeah, there were a lot of organizational inputs that we had. Our director has a very simple philosophy, which is fail forward. That's allowed us to not necessarily think about the risks, but do what was needed in the moment. That's why we think we were able to open up the raw water into the system. I think there's other communities that could have got lost in compliance and worried about consequences and those type of things. Kurt's quote in the slide is very telling, which was, we very quickly went from what we thought our role of protecting life by producing potable water to going towards, no, it was how can we prevent another house from getting lost or the fire from progressing any farther. So that's really what it was. We were able to make that paradigm shift, as he says, to go from how can we prevent it. And you know, it's interesting that through this lens that a water utility becomes an arm of first responders. So next question was, were underground water pipes in the neighborhoods destroyed? No, so that was one of the things that we found rather interesting, different between the California fires and here in Colorado, is because of our frost depth. The mains themselves did not end up with any fire damage, at least for the Marshall fire. So the mains were able to get through and we didn't have any replacement problems. The only concern was, again, that VOC contamination that backflowed into the system and we were able to flush out. So the next question was, how did the gravity flow of the untreated water from Marshall happen? So yeah, that was essentially folks at the Howard Berry plant, which is where this picture is at. We just opened up the valve, and since it's gravity, it was able to flow right on through. So we overflowed the basin that we're standing there, so water was kind of going everywhere, and that went directly into our potable storage tanks and then into the system. So there's I think we figured it out, there's about 140 feet of elevation difference between the Marshall intake and Louisville proper. And no, that it wasn't anything that we had anticipated earlier. It was a decision that we made up on the fly. It really was quite simply, we knew we were losing tank elevation, power wasn't available, and we needed more water into the system. And that was the solution that struck in the moment. We got a question from Jim here. So how to distribute the bottled water? Oh, so that was actually interesting. I wasn't involved in this one too much. We got a lot of donated supplies from a variety of folks. It was really interesting trying to set up the different locations for bottled water while the system tried to recover. It was just a massive community pour that allowed that to go. I think the rec center was our main location that we were distributing water from, but they used City Hall, the library. It was just kind of across the city wherever we needed to. So the next question is, how was the pressure at the fire hydrants after the homes were destroyed and services lines were leaking? So yeah, that's actually what we saw. We ended up modeling the fire a little bit after the fact. We think pressures dropped somewhere around 30 to 40 PSI in most of the areas. Obviously, the higher the neighborhood is to our pressure zone, the less pressure they would have at the hydrant. And then the other challenge that we had, there were so many different firefighting activities going on. They were really pulling in the system. So you had different firefighting groups pulling from one another, which really impacted the system heavily. I think I'm getting everybody's. I don't know if there's more questions coming through.
I was going to tag on to that thought just a little bit. So the city saw increased demands well through January above normal. And then that finally starts to taper off into February and going forward. And then you saw some lower and reduced demands because of the lost properties until about this year, when we're seeing a lot of the recovery, and so we're seeing demands actually finally come back to what we had seen pre-fire.
Yeah, and I'll mention one other thing for the neighborhoods that there was kind of the total devastation. We would routinely go in and not only for the flushing activities, but we were trying to simulate our demand to keep water age up. So that was one of the other things that we did as a staff is we were consistently going into the total devastated areas and just opening up the hydrants and allowing water to flow so that it stayed fresh and we maintained compliance that way.
If there aren't other questions for Corey and Katie, at the end of this hour, we were going to talk a little bit about the fire suppression pond statute and our experience with augmenting ponds for the 4 Mile Fire Protection District, and maybe get some comments from Katie and Corey about that. But the 4 Mile Fire Protection District is on 4 Mile Creek, which is just at the mouth of Boulder Canyon, tributary to Boulder Creek. And they owned or had contracts to use 4 different ponds along 4 Mile Creek for firefighting. And they put vaults, what I'll call vaults, that were screened and had pumps in them that fed hydrants that were built next to each of the 4 ponds. They had electricity attached to the pumps. Obviously, they also had generators because electricity power lines go down quickly in a fire. And each of the 4 pond owners got a cease and desist letter from the division saying you have to augment these ponds. So we filed an application to augment those ponds. Fortunately, there was Pine Brook water available in an appropriate reach to do that. And we're successful in getting a decree to augment the ponds. But early on in those discussions, we met with the CWCB, and they wanted 4 Mile Fire Protection District to augment all of the firefighting water that was used. So every bucket that was taken out by a helicopter, every tanker truck that was filled. We did not react to that suggestion very kindly, and they eventually backed off on that. But that position is out there to make it what seemed to us to be very difficult to legalize the ponds, but kind of the all for one spirit that has kind of manifested itself during all these fires. There was some pushback on that. There's a relatively new statute, maybe a couple of years old, 3782-107, where you can go through a process with the county and the state engineer to get certain qualified ponds approved as what I'll call exempt ponds, basically for fire suppression uses. It's hard to say. And we're aware of one pond that's going through that process that started a water court application to augment the pond and now has shifted to make it a fire suppression pond. But I guess, Corey and Katie, from your perspective, and maybe anybody else on the call, is that enough, or are there other ways? And I realize Louisville has done everything they probably can, but for other possible fire zones, that how best would you advise them to prepare to get fire suppression ponds, to have more storage, to have more interconnects with other districts and municipalities? What would be your suggestions on that?
Yeah, Alan, that's a great question. I mean, each community has kind of their unique approach to everything. You know, I think that's probably the biggest piece that I would see is, you know, plan where you think your interfaces are going to be from wildfire. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be wildfire. I mean, it can be any emergency. You know, just identifying that there is a risk and going through those tabletop exercises really prepares you or shows you where you have shortfalls. I do think that there should be something along those lines of, you know, hey, where can you dedicate certain storage space or certain areas or certain reservoirs for use? We actually had conversations with Louisville Fire. They were anticipating dipping into Harper Lake there. They just weren't sure how they were going to do it. And so the city's been looking at some possibilities ourselves of making that a specific location for, you know, emergency water supply. But it's really tough. You really have to understand your system, your limitations, where your interconnects are, who is your supporting networks, whether that's your neighboring communities or larger communities, and develop your plan that way.
I just wanted to add that in an emergency situation, nobody's going to go looking for a meter to put on a pump to pump water. They're just going to do it. And so that plays into the need for flexibility after the fact to make people whole if you need to, or to find some creative solutions to emergencies for in some instances you just can't anticipate.
My last comment would be to kind of follow up on Carolyn's comment that I think Corey's being a little bit modest about driving through the middle of the fire to get the propane tanks fired up, not literally, but to get the propane, bad word, in place at the South Treatment Plant. And there were really courageous and creative people at the City of Louisville staff that did everything they could to minimize the damage.
And I will just add that in helping to prepare this presentation, and 2 years after the fact, learning more of the details that I didn't know at the time, we can't say thank you enough to the water treatment plant staff at Louisville. You guys are amazing.
We like to say we were just doing our jobs.
Carolyn, have we taken enough of the hour?
I think you're good. Yes. Thank you so much. It's so much appreciated. And I really thank everyone who participated in this, in the fire response. There are a lot of homes standing because of what you did. And I know we've thanked the firefighters. We probably haven't thanked you guys enough. And so we're very, very appreciative.
You bet, Caroline. Actually, we've got a whole wall at the North Water Treatment Plant of thank you cards, and we had a Girl Scout troop come up, so we're all a little bit fatter from the cookies, and so yeah, we're a part of the community, and yeah, it's hard to go through the hurt, but we're onto the road to recovery, and yeah, again, we like to think we're just doing our jobs.
You didn't sign up for that, though. I mean, that's a little above and beyond. Come on. It wasn't in the job.
It's a little crazy. Yeah, you can say that.
Well, thank you everyone for attending. This was fascinating and just a really awesome talk. We'll hopefully be able to get this up on YouTube so you can share the link with other people. And I sent out a link just about an hour ago before the talk to some of my water operators, and just thought, these are good things for them to listen to too, to think about the what if. And so I encourage you guys all to share this talk after the fact as well.
Yeah, I guess I'd plug that as well. I mean, both our city council and our city manager have been very supportive of us sharing that. So we're working with a national group to help update just fire standards and fire response for a lot of different communities. And so, yeah, there's operator groups and management groups, and we'll continue to get the message out there just to hopefully make the next disaster a little bit easier for that folks.